And everybody else, thank you again for being here. I hope you had a great break. And we're going to get on this stage, we're going to get going with, oh my God, I did know, no, but you have a very good title, Rafa the Builder from mirror.xyz. He's the community lorecraft mirror in the talk, and his session is going to be called Community and Protocol DAOs, Core Building Blocks and How to Build a DAO Through a People Network. I also want to remind everybody that the POAP is ready. If you want to have it, it's in the back screen over there, so don't remind to get that before you leave. And I'm going to give it back, and I'm going to give it to you now, Rafa. Thank you.
Hey, everyone. Can you guys hear me? Yeah? Can I get a show of hands if you can hear me? All right, cool. Can I get a show of hands if you have been in a DAO? Can I get a show of hands if you have a definition for what a DAO is? All right, well, that sounds about right. All right. Don't worry, I didn't raise my hand either, so it's okay. So today, I'm going to talk about DAOs and designing a DAO and what it is. Although this is my first public presentation, so I'm a little bit anxious. I'm really glad you're here to support me. I'll talk about me. My name is Rafa. I love org design. I work at Mirror as a DAO lead. And yeah, you can hang out on Twitter. Come say hello in the replies. I love good conversations. For those of you who do not know, I work at Mirror, which is a decentralized publishing platform and set of toolkits. And we're building something pretty sweet. But one of the main questions that we have is, how do we decentralize something that's actually quite complicated, global, and has a fairly interesting technology stack? And so my job is to think about what that decentralization process looks like, but not necessarily from a technology standpoint, but more from the ownership perspective. And so as we kind of explore this concept, this is fairly new for all of us. As I just mentioned, we're still figuring out what the exact definition of a DAO is. So today I'm going to talk about this, and this is a spoiler alert. This is all I'm going to talk about today. We're going to deep dive into three main things. The first is we're going to talk about DAO tech as a thing. We're going to talk about it as the how, not necessarily the why or the what we're actually doing. We're going to talk about two categories, or a false binary of DAOs, thinking about it from a community and a protocol standpoint. And we're going to talk about a DAO's path. So depending on the context, how you would go about that. I'm going to try to speak a bit slower because I tend to speak a bit quickly. But if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me at any point, and I will let you know whether we can talk about it then or we can talk about it later. So far, so good? Hands up. Are we still here? Oh, we're still here. Cool. So DAO tech is the how, not the why or the what. Before I go in here, any brave souls want to give a definition of a DAO? As far as you know? Anybody? Yeah? Okay, we got one. Group of people who is bound by a sense of mission which is not yet defined. Did I get it about right? Cool. Have you guys heard this one before? Yeah? A show of hands. Have you heard of this one? Yeah, I've got a couple here. Yeah? I don't know. You know, I come back to this definition quite often, but I actually think this isn't necessarily true. So I'm going to give an alternative definition for the conversation today about some of the stuff that we've been discussing internally on Twitter, publicly, I guess. We can think about DAO. You know, we talk about this thing about a group chat with a bank account, but then you run into this issue, which is, well, who owns the bank account? Do we have a multi-sig? Do we have some automated governance? Do we have this? Do we have a token? And I think there's a slightly different analogy that we can think about, which is think about DAO tech as the rails on which a specific community grows online. So think about these like the train tracks or the train itself, but not necessarily the people that are in the train or the organization that manages the train. Another analogy, which I really like, is think about DAO tech as the code that actually delivers the community user experience. This kind of differentiates the DAO from the entity itself. So thinking about the organization as the mesh of the different software that connects it all together, you know, your finance system, your HR system, the bureaucracy that you actually build, from the entity itself, which is the organization. Now, why this is useful is because this may not necessarily be right, but it's potentially useful, is because it helps us abstract away the technology that we're actually putting together from the organizational entity, the mission, and how they actually are, you know, progressing towards a specific goal. So, but when we think about that as a DAO, as a technology, or as a set of toolkits, something really comes into mind, which is the DAO rails must be in harmony with the community culture and mission. So if you have a bank account, it's owned by a single person, that might be antithetical to the fact that you want a very pure democratic process in some cases. But it might not necessarily be out of line if you're still in the founding phase of an entity and you need rapid iteration and execution or distribution of funds, and you potentially have a benevolent founding team which are moving towards that. So we talk about progression towards decentralization. So I'm just going to go back here, level set. Instead of thinking about a DAO as a group chat with a bank account, we're going to think about the DAO as the technology on which a community specifically grows. And now when we think about the types of DAOs that potentially exist, that technology can design and evolve and emerge through what I have found two different pathways. This is a false binary, by the way. This is not necessarily true. It's not either or. It's not right or left. It's, you know, in between. But we're going to talk about two of them differently. So let me give an example. So in Uniswap, community design is downstream from the product mission. Does that make sense? No. Okay. So in Uniswap, we designed the protocol first, and then people got together, started using it, and then they governed it. So the community design happened after the product mission was actually executed, which is an automated market maker. Now, do you guys know what Kraus House is? Show of hands, anybody know? Some people. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about Kraus House. Kraus House is kind of cool. Kraus House is a DAO, and they're going to buy an NBA team in the US. If you don't know what an NBA team is, you can Google it. It's pretty cool, apparently. I don't really watch it, but, you know. It's a sports team, basketball, you know, with the hoops, Michael Jackson. No. That was a good joke. I thought I'd get a couple of chuckles. So Kraus House did a crowd fund, and they got a bunch of money together and got a bunch of people together, and they said, let's buy an NBA team. They didn't design a product. They didn't design a protocol. They got a bunch of people in the room first and gather a bunch of money, and now are executing on that vision by creating a series of products or a product portfolio. So there's a significant differentiation in terms of how you're evolving here in terms of the infrastructure that's being built. In the first instance here, in Uniswap, here, the infrastructure is the software that's coming first. In the second one, we could call it the social software. The community is coming together first. And this is an important differentiation for all of us to understand, because when we are building these new types of decentralized organizations, there's often a decision that needs to happen first when you launch, which is, am I going to think about the product? I'm going to anchor the product and then decentralize the product? Or am I going to think about aggregating the community together under the umbrella of a clear mission and then create a series of products which anchor themselves on that mission? So far, so good? So, another way to think about this is that Uniswap, the revenue center is actually the protocol core. So they did product market fit first, and then survival next of the protocol. But in Kraus House, they're going to buy an MBA team. The revenue center is actually the people that are there together. Together, they're generating revenue or aggregating cash or creating products which support their mission. So they're thinking about survival first of the mission. Can I create enough advocacy and evangelism? And then can I focus on product market fit afterwards? So far, so good? Does this resonate? Can I get a show of hands? Is this confusing? Yes or yes? All right. Can you ask a question and maybe I can clarify? No, no questions. All right. So, yeah, if you guys have a question, feel free to ask. It's okay. Yeah.
Let me test. Yeah, it works. Just make sure you say your name.
Hi, I'm Jamie. With the mission then product, so how do you de-risk the mission before you get a bunch of people on board?
Yeah, so you mean de-risk? Or validated the proof. Yeah, that's actually a very good question. So you need to do a lot of grassroots campaign and get enough people. I feel like nowadays, people are designing communities the same way that we used to design bridges, which is add as much steel as possible and hope that it doesn't like crack under pressure. So you have a magnitude level estimation on what your survival rate for your community is. So if you're starting a community, you're trying to get the most amount of people there as possible at the start. So you invest heavily in terms of marketing and advertising, right? And as much people as possible. But I think, especially for folks who have been in real life communities, you don't actually need 1 million people to support your mission. You actually need 100 true advocates. At most, maybe 1,000. In some cases, you only need 40 or 50 people who really believe in the mission and create a tight-knit community to govern it and execute it. But we're not that sophisticated right now at creating digital communities, so we're significantly over-engineering the process and saying, well, if I can get 1 million people, maybe in 2 years that might only be 500, but that's cool because that's probably enough to drive it forward. Does that answer your question? We don't. I think we're all sitting here hoping it will, right? But I think we're doing something right, it feels like at least. So going back to this original question about DAOs, when we think about it as a group bank account, and we think about it instead as the tech rails, I just want to drive this contrast home, which is in Uniswap, what they're doing, I'm calling it this, I don't know what it's going to be called in a year, but Uniswap is very much a protocol-centric DAO, which is it has a protocol with a treasury and governance process, versus Kraus House has a community, so a group of people with a shared bank account and specific governance tied to it. So there's a lot of software or I guess DAOware, hardware in the protocol environment, code, I would say it. And Kraus House, you have a lot of socialware, you have a lot of policies, you have missions, you have values, and you have governance, which depends a lot within people relationships. So in the first one, the code evolves into having people aligning around that code. In the second one, you have a lot of people who start creating code that aligns with how they are viewing the world and the missions that they have. So far, so good, kind of? Okay. So one of the things that I really like to think about is that it's actually fairly easy to identify whether the DAO that you're working on or the community, or I would say even the organization that you're working on, is kind of protocol-centric versus community-centric. And to me, you have to ask, am I organized by seasons or am I organized by games? Have you guys heard about a season in a DAO? Yeah, you've heard it? Anybody else? Yeah? So a season tends to be kind of like a period of time where everybody agrees that they're going to do kind of like a specific thing. It's a time-bound focus on a specific thing, kind of like a quarter in a business. Have you guys ever heard of a game in a DAO? That's special, might be. No? Yeah, this one's more on like Twitter. Maybe if you follow me, you might have read about it, but it's a bit niche. So the difference between a season and a game, don't worry, I'm going to explain it, but I'll leave the slides for you guys to read a little bit later. is that the game is not necessarily time-bound, it's logic-bound. So if we go back to Uniswap, Uniswap is logic-bound. I'm an automated market maker. I connect two people together who exchange assets. Kraus House has a time-bound rhythm. So every couple of months, they decide on something that they're going to do together, and they focus their energies on executing that together. So Kraus House sits in the seasoned aspect, limited time frame, boundaries defined by community objectives, usually sequential progression. You have a lot of consensus driven. You're building towards specific objectives. But you also tend to centralize because you get core contributors. That's okay, by the way. This isn't anything. This is not bad. You also have governance focus on treasury disbursement. So I'm going to allocate treasury to do a specific project. You know, I added here the Mirror DAO Season 1. But in reality, a lot of the DAOs actually work like this side. Fewer DAOs, at least in the social and the more emerging spaces, work on the game side. And the game side has a limited interaction frame. So let's say I'm going to swap two assets in DeFi, or I'm going to sell IP between two parties and have an escrow service. The boundaries are defined by the product protocol rules, so logic set. They usually go in parallel, so you can have multiple games that are going on at the same place. So Uniswap, for example, has Uniswap v3, and it might work in multiple chains. It's code-driven. You build out new tools from the game, so you expand outwards. It tends to decentralize because you create more competing communities. If you're familiar with Uniswap, you know fish.vote, where they're kind of like creating a delegation framework to be able to manage a governance. And the governance is focused on the protocol variables. Do I add a fee to Uniswap? An example of that is a mirror right race, so for some of you folks who have seen it before. So we talked about DAO tech as thinking about the how it's run, thinking about the two categories, which are community and protocol, and then the last piece is simply about the path from one to another. Yep. Yeah. I've got 10 minutes, guys, so you can still listen to me chat for a little bit longer. So the DAO's path depends on context. So one of the things that most people think about is that, oh, it's either one or another. So I'm going to get a community of people together, and then I'm going to build a thing, or I'm going to build a thing and then rally a community of people around the thing that is being built. But it's actually not binary, right? You can move from one to another. An example here is Cabin. Anybody familiar with Creator Cabins? Got a couple people around here. So they're moving from community. They did a crowdfunding. But now they're discussing using token curated registries as a core game. So they're moving from pure community to more of a game or a protocol-centric approach. Uniswap, on the other side, as I said, is I'm excited to announce Uniswap Exchange, and now they have an entire discourse forum where people vote and do a bunch of cool stuff on it, and then build products and tools on top of it. So one of the things that I would encourage all of you guys to think about is when you guys are thinking about decentralization and building organizations, ask yourself the question, are we building a product and rallying a community around it for the long-term survival of the product and protocol that we're building? Or are we building a community first that understands a long-term mission that we want to work towards and then build a series of portfolio products which contribute to that mission? Each of these has different design consequences. And as a result of those different design consequences, you will want to make different choices with regards of the governance frameworks that you choose, whether you want what types of consensus mechanisms you have, how you gather revenue, what type of revenue projections, and what type of ownership you want to distribute in what way. So I'll stop there, and we can ask some questions. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Questions? I'll bring the mic around and you can just say your name and ask the question. Please put your hand up. We have some.
Yeah, thanks, Rafa. This is a really good point. I was thinking of the analogy, like what a business model is to a startup is the community to a DAO, if that makes sense. And startups pivot their business model, right? So what do DAOs do? Does it come down to onboarding? And do you have any best practices in mind how a DAO really, makes sure to get there, what you've described?
Yeah, so startups have business models, and an example business model might be we're going to do a lab approach, right? We're going to try a lot of different stuff, throw some stuff to a wall and see what sticks. Or versus I'm going to do a lot of, like, for example, customer interviews, and then I'm going to design the perfect product for them. And you might have different go-to-market approaches. And you have this cyclical approach of reevaluating where you are. DAOs have something a little bit different because when you're dealing with, especially community ones, when you're dealing with a lot of people, you're dealing with a swarm. And it's a lot harder to pivot a swarm to go from one direction to another than it is to pivot a business, because the business kind of has a centered locus of control, right? My recommendation is you should actually not try to run a DAO like you run a business. So if you have a large group of people and you have a specific amount, like a business model that you put in place, in a startup, you would say, we're changing the business model. And you just move, right? You go from one quarter to another. But in a DAO, because you have a swarm engagement, it moves more like a meme. So how do you kill a meme? You don't. You have to create a new meme that actually garners enough energy and attention from the swarm that they move in that specific direction. So when we're thinking about business models and business model pivots, what we're actually thinking about is the different competing narratives that you have within the community that you engage with, and you really have to create a new compelling narrative to be able to focus the attention in that direction.
Next question.
Sure. Hey, thank you, Rafa. I'm Matt, based here in Berlin, and seen a number of the projects you work on, so cool to have you here. You kind of go in the direction of talking about memes and lore and like what's the narrative.
Yep.
How do you kind of instill that, like have the magic of the swarm, but then you have like, Discord and how do you get the momentum around the lore in such, when it's like a swarm? It seems like you're saying basically memes, but is that like, how do you do that as the community builder and within DAOs?
So the piece that I didn't talk about today, which I talked about seasoning games, the third part of the framework is what you're describing, which is the lore. So we can think about lore as your framework of reality. Venkat did a really good article about like recycling, and we all believe different things about recycling. And those sets of beliefs that we learn over time, over many decades, and the different exposure that we have in a very confusing information environment, create certain patterns of behaviors that we have with regards to recycling. I didn't split up my trash in the US, and now I do because I'm in Berlin. I need 5 trash cans. But there's the lore is a framework of reality that you work in, and that framework of reality, I would try to not centrally control it, because actually central control imposes a behavior on the community, and I think it might be a bit presumptuous to think that our version of reality is actually the correct version of reality for the swarm and the internet that you actually work in. How lore emerges is over time, and it's often based on mundane tasks. So there are some heroic stories, but I would recommend, for example, reading about Octavia Butler's essay on the carrier bag of fiction essay, which I can send some information, which is lore emerges from the daily activities that we do. So how do you create good lore in a community? How do you create lore which pushes you into the right direction? Well, you have to create the rails which create benevolent daily habits and make sure that those habits are the ones that get elevated and accentuated. It's kind of like growing up with a family, right? Your value systems are not defined by your parents usually sitting down and telling you these are your value systems. The value systems are often something that you extract from all the different consistent habits that you execute within the community. As a community steward, that might be designing for either the protocol, right, and attracting a community, or dealing with a community that does a crowdfund and then self-organizes. What you want to do is you want to reinforce specific consistency of habits and highlight the habits that you want to accentuate. That's the simple way to say it. I think the harder thing is we don't actually have a very strict playbook on how to do it just yet, maybe in a couple decades.
Well, that's the very quick last question.
Hi, can I just ask about the legal aspects of setting up a DAO? And especially like once you want to then launch a token and sell that token as a crowdfunding, how does all that work? To me, it's like a bit of obscure space.
So I am not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. You should do your own research. Something that I have seen, this is not a recommendation, this is a description of reality, is that there are two pathways so far for creating DAOs and moving into a legal environment. One is if you're creating a product or a protocol DAO, there's often an LLC, so standard organization, which gets built that receives funding in exchange for future ownership of the organization. And then when you decentralize, you pass on the protocol ownership from one entity, which is the private one, to the decentralized one. So what most people, I think, have seen is that it's not that you create one legal entity for the entire lifetime of the organization when you're dealing with a protocol. You deal with a private one, which does your R&D, build, potentially product market fit, and then when you decentralize, you pass the ownership on to a different legal entity, which I think the most common one that I have heard in the group chat so far is something around unincorporated nonprofit organization in the US. I don't know what the European equivalent would be. Now, if you're doing it from a community standpoint, the most common thing that I have seen done is many DAOs have not created any legal entity, have done the crowdfund under no framework whatsoever, receive the funding, and then as part of the first projects that they do, they get legal counsel and they create a legal entity. Most often than not, recently they end up with the same solution, which is the unincorporated nonprofit. Again, I am not a lawyer. This is a description of reality, not recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rafa, for being here.
Thank you.
An applause for Rafa, please, and for this presentation. Do you want to make an announcement where they can find you on Twitter?
You can find me on Twitter, Rafa the Builder. I'll be hanging around for a couple more minutes if you want to ask additional questions. Yeah, cheers. Thank you so much.
Thank you again.